church had for a heck of a long time got away with a quite different story, best explained by the remark made about Bernie Madoff. You may remember the man who made billions out of the Ponzi scheme, that his big mistake was offering returns in this life. Now, the church had for a heck of a long time got by, maybe promising returns in the next life. And what we want, of course, is returns here and now. Not least, of course, those of us who live in wealthy parts of the world, in Western liberal democracies, take for granted many of the freedoms and securities that we enjoy. But most of our fellow human beings in the world today, as almost all human beings in the past, suffer all sorts of deficits in the possibility of having good lives. Even so simple a thing as having to fetch water out, find food, or to learn how to read or write. The majority of our human beings labor under all sorts of barriers and difficulties, and we, as members of the same community as them, therefore have a responsibility to think about them and to do something about it, not to ignore them or their interests. Because it can't be a part of a good life lived by any one of us here in the West that we are conscious of the sufferings or the difficulties of people elsewhere and to ignore them. So the idea of broadly speaking, humanistic ethics in the small h sense is the idea of seeking to build the sort of life that the Renaissance celebrated, or some of the poets of the Renaissance celebrated, and that the thinkers of classical antiquity viewed as genuinely good. And it's no surprise that that should be so, because humanism, in this sense, is a much more ancient tradition than Christianity, and is nearly as old as Judaism. It comes, of course, there's a very strong humanistic streak in certain forms of Judaism, again, no surprise there, but it comes to us from classical antiquity. It comes to us in from the thinking of Aristotle and the Stoics and others. And when you read some of those thinkers in the past, discounting facts about their attitudes towards women and the fact that their society was based on slavery and the rest, but look for what the best of them thought about what the best possibilities were. And you see a very familiar picture, which has been a continuing theme, opposed very often and very often in conflict with religious ways of thinking about ethics, where a command comes to us from outside our world, outside our lives, demanding of us that we compete with some of the instincts that we have, some of the appetites we have, to try to act and live across the grain of our nature very often in order to survive this, which is represented to us as some kind of test, in order to get that payoff in the afterlife. And the humanist tradition, with its very different focus, its focus on now, offers us a quite different way of thinking about what we mean when we talk about ethics. I sometimes say to my students when I'm giving one of these secular sermons to them, people tend to think that life is going to begin when, and then there's ... and then they fill in the dots with graduated or got married or got a job or published my first book or paper or something like that. You know, life is always going to begin at some point in the future when some of these messy things have been got out of the way. Well, of course, the answer is that life is now. This is why Epictetus always used to say to his students as they left after a day's instruction, he would say to them, how long are you going to delay to be wise? To start living the good life. And the tenor of all these remarks is that what a humanistic ethic says to people is that here, now, in this moment, in this day of our lives, is the opportunity to begin thinking about the construction of the good. Of course, we've all done it in many ways, and we've made plenty of choices, but quite often we've done it without conceiving it as something that is genuinely chosen and genuinely the product of reflection, the kind of reflection enjoined on us by Socrates. So I can conclude now by trying to bring together these two different ways of thinking of the ethics of rationality, ethics of inquiry on the one hand, on the other hand, ethics in the general sense, which demands of us, if we are going to be atheists, that we reflect as Socrates demanded, and that we make important choices, and that we do the work of realizing those values that we've chosen. Like this. If you look at Christian ethics, let's say, you notice something rather interesting about them. You notice that the ethics of the New Testament, the canonical Gospels and St. Paul's letters, and to some extent the Acts as well, are very distinctive. They're not very original, and they're not very broad in scope. Russell was right to say that Socrates was more intelligent and the Buddha more compassionate than Jesus, which is always a remark that upsets people, but it's true. But you see that they're very narrowly conceived. What we're told by the New Testament is this: give away everything you have, take no thought for the morrow, make no plans. When bad things happen, don't contest them, turn the other cheek. If your family don't agree with you, or people close to you, children, your parents, whatever, turn your backs on them. Leave them behind. Now this, and I've got one or two other things besides, okay? Now this is extraordinary in its demand. But the reason why people sincerely accepted this view was because they really thought that the end of the world was coming. They thought the parousia, the second coming of Christ, was imminent. 2 weeks, 2 months. That's why you didn't marry, you didn't have to save money, you didn't have to plan. You best to give everything away. You know, the rich man had more difficulty into heaven than the camel in the eye of the needle, and so on. You know, really strip yourself bare, become a hippie, tune in, drop out, wait. The end of the world is just about to come. And when it didn't come for several centuries, there was a sort of a, you know, looking at the watch attitude. The Christian faith, once it had managed to get rid of some heresies and it started to make itself a bit more orthodox, and it generated a certain amount of agreement on doctrine, was in need of ethics. It was in need of a much richer, more thoughtful ethical tradition. And it imported it pretty well wholesale from the Greek tradition, much as it imported pretty well wholesale its metaphysics via Neoplatonism. It didn't have metaphysics. You look pretty hard for any ontological discussion in the New Testament. So it had to import these ideas several centuries in. And so when people say the Western tradition is a Christian tradition, or when they talk of Christian ethics, when they talk of the Christian gentleman, for example, little do they know, because of course they purposely truncate everything at about the 3rd century AD, that they're actually talking about the Aristotelian megalopsychos. That's the great-souled man of Aristotle, or the Stoic who has courage with respect to what he cannot control and self-mastery with respect to what he can, his own fears and desires and appetites. They're talking about something which has come out of a fundamentally secular humanist tradition, imported into Christianity and hijacked by it. And this is a very important point. Human beings do need their moments of quiet, their important transitions in life. When we welcome a new member of the family, when we get married, when people die. We need those ceremonies, those celebrations, those get-togethers that mark important moments in our life. We need some rituals. We also need the satisfaction of that part of ourselves that we are in the habit of calling the spiritual aspect of ourselves. And I use the term, of course, in a completely secular and materialist kind of way to mean the complex of our emotional responses and our intellectual attitudes. So both the ritual aspect and the secularly understood spiritual aspect of our lives are a very important part of us. And we all know how we sometimes have those great metaphysical yearnings, how sometimes we respond to things in the world with real profound emotion. We're moved by things, by kindness, for example. We're transported by love. We're stirred by wonderful music, by the beauty of nature. And all these aspects of our experience are real and important aspects of ourselves. Now, the religions have hijacked all that. Spirituality belongs to religious observance. When somebody goes to a beautiful hilltop and looks out across the sea and there's the sunset, what do they say? They say, "Oh, thank you, God, beautiful world." You know, because that's become a kind of a reflex that they've been taught to have. But a walk in the country, or looking at pictures in an exhibition, listening to music at a concert, having lunch with friends, these are spiritual exercises in every bit as much as the Ignatius Loyola spiritual exercises of the Jesuit order. And what we have to do in thinking about humanistic ethics is to recover ownership of those aspects of our experience and to recognize that they have nothing to do with gods and goddesses and fairies at the bottom of the garden. But there are aspects of human experience which are the very best parts of human experience. The sense of belonging to a world, to a humanity, to a universe, which has wonderful and striking things in it, is every bit as a part of us as our belonging to a world and a humanity capable of greed and conflict and unkindness. And the work that we do against the negative and bad things in our experience and in our world should be more than compensated for and complemented by this capacity that we have to thrill to things that are rich and good, like the affection of our friends and the beauties that we find in nature and that we can create out of our own wonderful genius, because human beings are such clever monkeys. Primates, I should say. Apes, I should even better say, since we have that biologist among us. So we should be conscious of those things, and we should regard the possibilities of a humanist ethics as being very rich ones, and we should see that there is no reason why we shouldn't talk about some of these things, why we shouldn't take possession of them again from the religions, which have tried all through to hijack our spirituality, to hijack our discussion of ethics, as though only they, or only in those places that they denominate, the churches and the mosques and the temples and the synagogues, is it possible to think those things or feel them or to have those attitudes. We can have them. It's a really important part of what we do and what we feel, and yet we can do it without having to believe in fairies. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot to Grayling for this very Epicurean talk, and now it's time for questions, and please align up here.